The opinions expressed by the host and guests on Where Did the Road Go are their own and do not represent those of WVBR or its management. Our aim is to explore the fringe, lost civilizations, alternative science, the paranormal, and much more. Join us on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com, where you can send us questions for our live or future guests via email or the live chat room. And remember to subscribe to us on iTunes. And now welcome to this week's edition of Where Did the Road Go?
And I am your host, Soraya, as always, here on Where Did the Road Go? And tonight we're going to be talking to Lyle Blackburn. And his latest book is Lizard Man, The True Story of the Bishopville Monster. And you with us, Lyle?
I'm here.
All right. I know we were having a little bit of problem with Skype, so hopefully that won't continue.
Yes, we will forge on. Nobody can suppress the Lizard Man.
All right, and you're also a musician. We'll get to some of your music later on tonight to end the show. And you've written one other book on cryptozoology, which we had you on for before. And do you want to tell people how you got into all of this?
Well, you know, it was one of those things I was always interested in as a kid. You know, watched documentaries about everything from ghosts to UFOs, and of course unexplained monsters like Bigfoot, Loch Ness, things like that. And later in life, I'd read a lot about the subjects, and eventually started writing for a horror magazine called RUE MORGUE. And because of my interest and knowledge in cryptozoology, they kind of had me covering movies that always had, horror movies with Bigfoot and things like that, because I kind of, loved horror movies, but also knew the real world cryptozoology side of it. And through that, it led to me wanting to write a book. And of course, I'm thinking, well, what would I want to write a book about? And I ended up choosing the subject of the legend of Boggy Creek, which is a kind of a famous historical Bigfoot incident in southwest Arkansas. So that led to my first book, The Beast of Boggy Creek, which was quite successful and got great feedback. So I just kind of forged on with that and, selected a new case to research, which ended up being the Lizard Man. But, I've since been on the TV shows. I've been on Monsters and Mysteries in America several times, been on Finding Bigfoot and several other shows. So it just sort of, once I got rolling, it just sort of engulfed me.
All right, and Boggy Creek wasn't that far from where you were located, right?
Right. I live and grew up near the Dallas-Fort Worth area of Texas, and the Boggy Creek thing all happened in Fouke, Arkansas, which is near Texarkana, just across the border from me into Arkansas.
So what made you decide to look into the Lizard Man?
Well, it was it just sort of happened, because after the Beast of Boggy Creek, I'm thinking, okay, what am I going to do next? And I've kind of got, quote unquote, a hit book, and I'm thinking, I got to do something interesting here. And I wanted to stick with kind of that southern flavor, because the Beast of Boggy Creek, being in Arkansas and all the things that took place here kind of had that southern Bigfoot type thing. And also it was a swampy area, so I decided to look into some other swamps in the southeastern United States, and I went on what I called a swamp tour. And just visited places like Okefenokee in Georgia and Honey Island Swamp in Louisiana. And I was just, was knowledgeable about some of the sightings that have happened in there, those places of unexplained creatures. And I just went there and talked to some locals. And I ended up also going to Bishopville, South Carolina, where there's an area called Scape-Ore Swamp. And I was aware of this Lizard Man story that had taken place there starting in the late 80s. And once I got there and started talking to some of the locals, and I was able to interview a sheriff that had investigated the case from its outset, and I realized there was a whole lot more to the story than I'd ever read. It was very interesting, and just the way everything played out, and just the whole concept of something called the Lizard Man. It was intriguing. Was this sort of a creature from the Black Lagoon. Just what was this thing? And it just made for a great story. So I thought, here's the subject, and I just set about writing the book.
All right. Okay. I know Micah Hanks claims that he also kind of took you on the trail of it as well.
Yeah, that's true, because I kind of bounced various ideas off some of my colleagues. And we were at an event in Sacramento, California, of all places. I guess we got to talking about the lizard man. I'm like, I don't know, it's got some good stuff. And he's like, no, you should really look into it. I think it could work. And so that's one of the things that I value my colleagues' opinions, and a lot of other guys. Nick Redfern and Ken Gerhard and Craig Woolheater, I bounce off ideas, and so he was definitely one of those that had a thumbs up on that story.
And Nick actually wrote the foreword to this book.
Right. Yeah. So there again, I thought, hey, Nick, he's kind of. We've had some discussions about the Lizard Man and books, and he seemed to have the right angle for writing the forward to this. And Nick and I both live here in Texas, so we work together on a few things.
Oh, cool. So what was the first thing that brought the Lizard Man to the public attention?
Well, it was kind of funny how that played out, because it was in July of 1988 in the sheriff's office. The Lee County Sheriff's Office got a call from some folks who lived down near Skateboard Swamp there, just outside of Bishopville, South Carolina, and they said, we don't know how to put this, but it looks like our car has been attacked by an animal. And the sheriff's office like, what? Come on down and take a look. It looks like it's been chewed up, and there's footprints, and there's hair, and there's some evidence that looked like animals were chewing up our car. So the couple of deputies went down there, and they took a look, and they didn't quite know what to make of it. So they called the sheriff, Liston Truesdale, and said, hey, man, you need to come down here. I don't know what to make of this. I don't know what what happened, but it does appear that an animal attacked this car. So the sheriff went out, and in the process of looking into this, some of the locals came up and said, hey, maybe it was the Lizard Man. And the sheriff's like, the Lizard Man? What do you mean? They said, well, in the last, year or so, people down here in this area have been seeing a creature. It's maybe 7 feet tall. It walks on two legs, and it's either kind of brown or greenish, some kind of strange creature, and we call it the Lizard Man. And of course, the sheriff was very dubious about this whole thing, but he thought, well, something's amiss here. So he played along and said, anybody who's seen this so-called creature, come to the, office, or have them get in touch with me. I want to know what's going on. He said, nobody's in trouble. I'm just asking questions. And so once the incident about the car mauling got printed in the newspaper, this led a father to bring his son down to the sheriff's office a few days later, and he said, my son's got a very strange story for you. And this young man, Christopher Davis, who was 17 at the time, went on to tell the sheriff that he had been driving home from work one evening late at night, had a flat tire near Skateboard Swamp, and just about the time he was putting the jack and the spare tire back in his trunk, he said that he could see something coming across the grass in the moonlight, and it looked to be a human at first, but as it got closer, he could see that it was something different, something monstrous. And he said it had, red eyes, maybe greenish skin. It had 3 fingers and long fingernails. Of course, he jumps in the car and tries to tear out of there, and this thing basically tries to get in the car. He ends up getting away. So this was basically the first and foremost Lizard Man sighting, and because it appeared to have attacked this kid, was something of a, raised some eyebrows there at the sheriff's office. And the sheriff did believe his story. I mean, he interviewed this kid and, put him through the paces. But from what the sheriff could tell, that something really did happen to this kid. He wasn't sure what it was, but something happened. And that's where it all got started. And then the sheriff's office obviously wanted to look into this further to see if there was some kind of hoax going on, because there was a possibility somebody could get hurt.
Right, right. What were your impressions of the sheriff Truesdale?
I found him to be a very friendly guy, very he was open-minded, but a thorough investigator, and somebody who, which is rare with the law enforcement. Usually, it's just immediately this stuff is considered nonsense, and they don't look into it any further. But he felt that there was enough to it, and he thought, if I don't look into this and somebody gets hurt, then then they're going to point fingers at me. So he kind of had his hands tied. I could tell that he was one that really wanted to solve this mystery. I mean, to this day, some of those events are just completely unexplainable. They're very strange, and he spent, I guess, since then. I mean, he's really been associated with the Lizardman case, and has been, like any of us, just hoping to put the pieces together and solve this mystery. And I found him to be a very likable guy. He was very forthcoming and just told the facts like they are. I mean, he wasn't trying to, convince me there's a lizard man. He wasn't trying to not convince me. He just said, here's the facts. Here's what we did. Here's who we investigated. Here's the police files. He gave me access to a whole chest full of just police documents and newspaper clippings. So it was amazing. And, it really helped my case, to help me to research the case.
Yeah, I'm sure. Now, Chris Davis was the kid that was attacked, and he had also passed like a lie detector test and stuff like that as well.
Right. I mean, for what it's worth, I mean, polygraph, is not highly regarded in the court system, but nonetheless, I mean, at least you're right. At least, they tried to evaluate his story as best they could. So there was lie detectors, and God, that kid was interviewed countless times, and he stuck to his story.
And he was the first one to come forward, but he wasn't the first actual sighting of this thing.
Right, and that's one of the things that I learned in my investigation, because when you read in cryptozoology books or wherever they mention the lizard man story, they pretty much start with the Christopher Davis sighting. But what I found was interesting and very telling was that several people came forward later on saying that they had seen this thing much earlier, as early as 2 years prior. So there was some sightings that I wasn't really familiar with, of people saying they had seen, some kind of strange animal or whatever it was down in that skateboard swamp area. So that was interesting to me, and at least built a little more of a case to say that there was something going on before Christopher Davis ever came forward.
And so what is the earliest sighting?
The earliest would be George Plyler, which would have been in 1986. And in that case, he lives pretty close to Skateboard Swamp, and they were building a hog pen down in the swamp area somewhere. And as they were working, he got a glimpse of some kind of creature standing in the trees, and he kind of looked up and tried to get a better look at it, and the thing ran off into the brush. And his description of it was very vague, but he said it had long arms, maybe ape-like. He said its body wasn't very bulky, but it appeared humanoid, but not like a man. And so, while he didn't get a real good look at it, this is a guy who lives in that area. He's quite familiar with the animals that normally prowl around. So that was kind of the first one. And there was another one in 1987 in which a guy was riding a bicycle down in the area, and just after dusk saw just a silhouette of a very large creature walking on two legs for a brief moment before a car drove by, and it walked off into the woods.
And all of these accounts actually, I mean, it's called the Bishopville Monster, but it actually is around a swamp area called Skateboard.
Right, Skateboard Swamp, which is, I mean, it's just right outside of Bishopville. Bishopville is a small town. I mean, this is the middle of South Carolina, and I mean, this is one of the cool things I thought that was right up my alley. I mean, the Boggy Creek case is, a small town, and then suddenly they're associated with a big monster legend, and so is Bishopville. So while the sightings didn't actually occur right in Bishopville, they were on the outskirts in this area called Browntown near Skateboard Swamp, which is, obviously the more likely place. I mean, right up in the town is not where you're going to see these creatures. They're definitely going to be in the fringes of civilization, and Skateboard Swamp is certainly especially back in the late 80s, it was definitely a very rugged and remote place where, an unknown animal could potentially live.
Okay. And the name of the swamp, it looks like you tried to research some of this, but never really came to a full conclusion of where the name came from.
Right. And that was another interesting thing to the story, because when I first heard the name Scape Ore Swamp, I'm thinking, Scape Ore, what is this? And sure enough, there's a compelling backstory as to how that name how that swamp got its name. And while there's no, definitive historical source that actually tells you, there's various theories, and one of them was that in a local township around there was a lady of the night, so to speak, and the parishioners at the local church didn't approve of her occupation and ended up running her out of town, and she ran into that swamp. So the swamp got the name Escaped Horror Swamp. It's just sort of, I guess the nickname for the swamp, which sort of became the name. And later on, I think people, didn't really want
right.
an area called Escaped Horror, so then it was shortened and changed. And there was several other stories associated with it. But it made a good chapter in the book. Just, kind of fascinating, just the evolution of this swamp.
Yeah, and you looked at some other possibilities of where it came from as well. So what did this thing, like, everyone's description of this was a little bit different, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was one of the puzzling things about it. There was no really solid, consistent description. And, obviously when you're dealing with something called the lizard man, I'm guilty of this. My imagination sort of gravitated towards almost, something more ridiculous than people were actually describing. But in a lot of cases, people described it not so much in reptilian terms. While some of them said they thought its skin was green, and a couple of them actually said they saw what they thought was a tail. Several people said they were definitely sure that it was brownish in color and was actually had hair. So, of course, now I'm thinking, well, could these people have seen a Bigfoot? And in some cases, maybe the thing was wet, or it had come out of the swamp, or it was, had a patchy skin condition or something else. Are we dealing with a Bigfoot sighting here in which the locals, just called it the lizard man? So that was, something to sort out as it went forward, and I took down compared the witness descriptions.
And isn't there only one really good report that reported a tail? Yeah,
there was an Air Force colonel that, saw it cross the road back in 1988. And this was one of the guys, by this time, he was familiar and had seen the news reports and the things coming out in the media, and he thought it was totally ridiculous. But sure enough, one evening he was, I suppose, lucky or unlucky enough to see this thing run across the road. And he did say that he thought it had a tail. So, you're like, I don't know. It makes it hard to sort out those things. But the bottom line, that sighting, he was fairly certain it wasn't a bear, and it didn't appear to be a human. This thing ran right across in front of the car. So, hoaxers don't typically run in front of the car. They may run on the side of the road, but I'm thinking that's a pretty risky proposition in the dark to just suddenly dart out right in front of the car. So, ultimately no proof of what he saw, but he did suggest at least that it had some more reptilian traits.
And the media frenzy around this was pretty intense, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was really astounding. I mean, I was amazed at the coverage this thing got. And in the summer of 1988, within weeks, literally, that thing was everywhere. NBC Nightly News, on ABC did a news channel. Dan Rather reported on it. They did a live broadcast on Good Morning America from Skateboard Swamp. It was mentioned in Time magazine, magazines halfway around the world like Korea Times, and just in all the newspapers down there all the time. It was just, I don't know, it was just the craziest thing I've ever seen on how much news coverage it generated, and how I guess something called the Lizard Man, and of course Christopher Davis's sighting with him nearly being attacked and all that is so sensational that it really grabbed people's attention, and just led to this really concentrated media frenzy which surrounded the whole thing.
And how did the town react to that?
Well, and I always find this interesting as well, as how these little towns react to, sightings of strange monsters in their vicinity. And in Bishopville, not unlike other towns, even Fouke, Arkansas, where Boggy Creek is, some people, some of the townsfolk, thought it was completely ridiculous. Some of them thought it was interesting. Some of them were embarrassed, and this kind of carries on into the future, because now if you do a search on Bishopville, South Carolina, right up there is their association with the Lizard Man. I mean, they cannot ever escape that reputation or the legend of the Lizard Man. So they're kind of stuck with it for better or worse, and so. There's folks in town. There's a little cotton museum there, and they have a little display regarding the Lizard Man history. So, for historical purposes, these towns say, hey, it's part of our history, and this is what it is. But, there's no giant statues of a Lizard Man or anything. Not unlike if you were to go to Point Pleasant, West Virginia, there's a really nice statue of the Mothman in their downtown area. So they've really sort of just taken the ball and run with it, whereas in Bishopville, it's a little half and half.
Now there were at least a few hoaxes, and even the Chris Davis one. At some point, someone said that it was a farmer in a burlap sack that scared this kid. Yeah,
there was a lot of theories and conjecture, and people coming out and claiming, that this person or that person was responsible for some of these sightings, and especially the Chris Davis incident. There was talk going around that a farmer had actually been responsible for that, because he had some air conditioners stolen from a shed that was out there near his butterbean farm. And so, as the story goes, he heard somebody park out there, and and this is a remote area where this farm area is. It's just on the edge of Skateboard Swamp, and there's just hardly any there, or at least there were hardly any houses out there in 1988. It's still in the countryside today, obviously, but he said he heard somebody park out there, and so he went out to investigate, thinking it was somebody who was going to steal an air conditioner. And apparently he, for whatever reason, came out with a burlap sack over him and all this stuff, and ended up, running after this person, and the person jumped in the car and left. And then several days later, he sees this story in the newspaper, how a Lizard Man attacked Christopher Davis. So, unfortunately, there was, no definitive proof either way, and it certainly makes a good story. But this farmer later allegedly came back and said that he didn't do it, that that was just rumor. He, people thought that he did it. So it was all these discrepancies. And just recently, which I wasn't aware of when I wrote the book, somebody claimed that this other person was actually responsible for it, and and that they had been wearing a Halloween mask, and that's what they did, is run around and scare people, and that they had been responsible for all the lizard man sightings, which is completely ridiculous. I mean, this person didn't even live near Bishopville, and this person would have had to been out there for 4 years, appearing in the swamp and all kinds of places and jumping out at cars.
And just hoping somebody would come by.
Right. I mean, it's preposterous. And so I'm constantly hearing this type of stuff, and I'll hear people with very narrow knowledge of the subject say, "Oh yeah, well, I heard that so and so is a lizard man because of this," and I'm like, "But did you know?" And I fill them full of facts, and and it sort of just explains away this. Not to say that any one of those incidents isn't a hoax, or it wasn't even, or in the case of a farmer, maybe a mistake that turned into somebody's misinterpreting something. But to say that one person had been responsible for all this, like it's a master plan to create a lizard man, is just absurd. There was just too many sightings, and there was, some pretty circumstantial evidence to say that it couldn't have been one person.
And also the fact that the sightings weren't exactly the same leads me to believe that they weren't being made up.
Right, yeah. This wasn't some fabrication or hallucination or anything like that,
It seems like if people were making it up, they would be more exactly what they think they would have seen.
Yes, exactly. I mean, if people are trying to make further tales of the lizard man, would they then later decide, oh, well, we better dress up in something that's, hairy and brown? No, they're going to dress like you think a lizard man would look. And I think that the fact that the witnesses reported something that kind of went against the big media portrayal of it shows you that they're just telling you what they saw. They're not, it's not someone dressed up in a lizard man costume.
And who coined the term lizard man?
It was the locals, and when they came up to the sheriff while he was out there investigating that mauled car, they're the ones that called it the lizard man. So Sheriff Truesdale was never really certain who actually coined that term. It was just one of those things that just evolved, I guess. And the locals said, "Well, yeah, they call it the lizard man." So it just was. It came into being almost. It was just something where you just really couldn't trace it back, and nobody's ever came forward saying, "I was the first one who coined lizard man." Nobody's ever claimed that. So
as the sightings there were a lot of them in the 80s, but then they kind of dropped off a little. But there's still been periodic sightings up to almost present day, correct?
Well, the sightings trailed off. There were sightings, a concentration of sightings in 1988, or at least in 1988 in the summer when it came out. Then people were telling about their sightings, and of course, like we mentioned, there was some in a couple of years prior to that. After that, it kind of died down for a bit, and then there was a few more sightings a couple of years later, and in both of those sightings, it sounded to me straight up like they saw a Sasquatch. So they had the thing that's continued, which is not, there's no direct connection to the quote-unquote lizard man, but these incidents of where cars have been mauled in 2008 and 2011, there was 2 incidents of this same thing where some Dodge vans, the folks, they live near Escape Swamp. They come out one morning and they discover their car had been scratched up, eaten up, torn up, and appeared to be some kind of animal that had done this. And so it's really strange. Those incidents, those kind of things do happen. It's not, not just in Bishopville. Cars do get mauled from time to time. But just the fact that it happened so many times near Skateboard Swamp was quite interesting. And that's sort of always, of course, when that happens, it brings up the tales of the lizard man. Could it be the return of the lizard man? And it just adds to the mystery of this case. I mean, just some weird stuff going on, and that has continued up until this time.
Now, were they able to determine anything about the car damage? Because it looked like something bit it, correct?
Yeah, it looked like teeth holes and scratches, and in the first case in 1988, I've seen photos, and there's photos in my book of all these cars. Like I said, I had access to all the police files, and they had photographs of all these cases. And you can see in the first one, there's some paw prints on it, and it looked like animals, had been possibly even fighting, because there was smaller paw prints which looked like maybe a fox, and then there was some bigger prints that left off into the swamp. But at that time, of course, they couldn't test for DNA or do very much. They just had a wildlife biologist, come down and look at it and make his opinion. Fast forward to 2008 when this happens. Now, DNA tests and technology like that is much more widely available and economical. So they did do some DNA tests on the car from 2008, which came back saying that it was a canine, which the sheriff at the time, which was Sheriff Truesdale, had retired, so we had a new sheriff. He didn't think that was correct. He said, having seen what had been done to that car, I just cannot imagine a dog did it. And so, he cast some doubt on the whole thing. Nobody really ever agreed as to what really did that. But at least they were able to run some DNA, and they weren't sure because the car had been driven around since that, and there was some blood on the car, and the couple who owned it said, well, it could have been contaminated because we drove over to it was a neighbor's house or somebody else's house, and they had some dogs that were all over the car trying to lick at the blood. Yeah. So it could have contaminated it. Who knows? It's, like in all these cases, it's always just, you can't quite figure it out. But so the case in 2011, when that happened, they're like, look, we're not running any more DNA tests. We're done. I think they resolved to the fact that cars get chewed up in Bishopville, South Carolina, and that's just going to be the way it is. And they left it at the.
And both of them were Dodge vans.
Yeah, that's a weird thing. Which, I can add a little humor to the book, and by saying the lizard man apparently has a taste for Dodge vans.
All right, we got to take a quick break. We'll be back in 45 seconds with Lyle Blackburn.
The opinions expressed by the host and guests on Where Did the Road Go are their own and do not represent those of WVBR or its management. Join us on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com, where you can send us questions for our live guests via email or the live chat room. You can also check out our upcoming schedule, blog, links section, book reviews, videos, and links to our Twitter, Facebook, iTunes, and much more. That's wheredidtheroadgo.com.
And if you have any questions you'd like me to pass along to Lyle, come into the chat. That is www.wheredidtheroadgo.com, and I'll pass them along. Now, as far as the car destruction, we've been talking to Lyle about his book, The Lizard Man. You said that Sci-Fi's Fact or Fake tried to look into this, correct?
Correct. It was featured on one of their shows, which, like it or hate it or whatever, it really was some of the best scientific tests that had been done to try to determine, what kind of animal could do this if an animal did. Oh, and so basically they kind of explored, as that show does, they try to recreate, whether it's a video or in this case, some car damage. They tried to replicate that using what would be available, like tools, or they thought, well, it's got holes. Was it guns? did an animal like an alligator bite through it? And they tried to replicate those tests. And they did one with power tools, which looked pretty close. It was about the closest looking thing. But to me, it's like, okay, well, that's great. But you're telling me that, either the homeowners decided to use power tools on their own car for what purpose? It's a crazy insurance scam, if anything. And these folks were, the sheriff had interviewed these. These are not scammers or con artists or criminals. I mean, these are honest, hardworking homeowners, not going to take to their car with power tools. So then you're left with a scenario, okay, did some vandals drive by and vandalize their car using power tools in the middle of the night? How much noise would that, I mean, you couldn't sleep through it. So, again, you're left with unanswered questions.
The factor faked. When it first started, I thought, well, this is a great idea for a show where they could go and actually fact check some of these claims and try to reproduce them. But it seems like they ended up just shortcutting a lot of these things and going with sort of a predetermined idea that they were just going to recreate a hoax or something like that.
Yeah, and I think they, I guess they, for a TV show, they do their best, and some of it's quite impressive on what they can do, but ultimately they're not there spending, I spent at least 6 solid months working on this, talking back and forth with people and the sheriff and looking at photos and doing, I spent a lot of time looking back and forth. This isn't just let's go do this for a week and then make an assumption at that point. I spent a lot of time, and it's just not that easy to explain. And so while they say, oh, it's power tools, that's definitely what did it, there you go. Yeah, but then I'm asking the other questions. Who's coming down there running power tools in the middle of the night? Do you have, they leave a lot of things unanswered.
Maybe it was the lizard man with power tools.
Yes, see, he has a generator and some extension cords coming out of skateboard. He's working.
And really doesn't like Dodge vans.
He hates them Dodge vans. So.
Now, didn't somebody say that they thought a pit bull might be able to replicate that type of damage?
Yeah, and I kind of just try to, in my books, I always try to include both sides. Whatever anybody's, an authority on these subjects chimes in, I want to hear from them. So, one person felt that, definitely is possible that something like a pit bull could damage the car like that. And I mean, I suppose it's possible. I mean, there's some serious damage though to those cars. I mean, the hood is metal and there is teeth marks right in it. So if this was a pit bull, this had to have been a gang of extremely deranged pit bulls to go to that extent. And so again, there's no way to tell unless they could get this thing on, get it on camera or something.
Yeah. And you said there's been other areas where car damage like this has occurred?
Yeah, I know of another, interestingly enough, there was a case in Palm Springs, California about a year and a half, in which kind of the same thing happened. A homeowner came out and found his car all chewed up, and he was baffled and called the police, thinking somebody's vandalized it. But it sort of looks like it's been chewed on. There's teeth marks, and some of the neighbors said, well, it's kind of weird. We saw these humongous black dogs running through this area, and they live in an area of California, kind of on the edge of some, I guess, arid desert-like terrain, and people reported seeing these oversized black dogs. So there's another case that all halfway, all the way across the U.S. where you do have some similar damage. And actually, let's see, tomorrow night on that show, Monsters and Mysteries in America on Destination America Channel, I did a brief interview with them for a segment about hellhounds, and actually they talk about that very case in which that car was eaten up. So I'm on that, and then following that, next week on January the 11th, they're doing a Lizard Man episode in which I'm on that episode as well. I was out in Skateboard Swamp, as a matter of fact, doing an interview about the Lizard Man. So it's kind of cool that Monsters and Mysteries has covered some of these more obscure cases and, reenacting these and bringing forward the stories on TV.
Yeah, absolutely. What about tracks and stuff like that, and other evidence to support the existence of an actual creature?
Well, there was actually some three-toed tracks that were found in 1988, and prior to looking into the case, I had seen these photos of these, and this comes up constantly when dealing with the Lizard Man case. But the tracks look rather hokey, and I mean, from the get-go, even before I knew much about the Lizard Man, when I saw those tracks, I thought, I don't know about that. It's kind of ridiculous. Doesn't look like a real animal. So, obviously I looked into that. It was an interesting story on how the police actually found those, and it was some deputies that found those tracks under mysterious circumstances one night out by Skateboard Swamp, in which they were investigating some strange howling noises coming from the area. And as they drove down this dirt road, and they ended up taking a U-turn and coming back, is when they saw these tracks going across the road. Well, they tried bringing dogs out and following the tracks, and they cast some of the tracks with plaster and preserved them, and you can still see those down there at the South Carolina Cotton Museum in Bishopville for posterity purposes. But when you start looking at these tracks, they look pretty hokey, and as it turns out, they're a bit suspect. However, I did talk to some other researchers in South Carolina, some guys who had been in that area doing a lot of research, and they claimed to have found some three-toed tracks that they felt were legitimate in that area. And these three-toed tracks are often associated with either Lizard Man or swamp-dwelling cryptids. Honey Island swamp monsters said to have three toes. Even the Fouke monster of Boggy Creek fame, being a southern Bigfoot, there were some three-toed tracks found of that creature, which I talk about in my other book. But it's kind of strange, the connection of these creatures with these three-toed tracks. But in the case of Bishopville, it seems like a lot of the case, there was a lot of mystery surrounding each piece of evidence. So unfortunately, outside of the tracks, there was nothing else, and no one ever got a photo. No one found any hair or scales, so to speak, that were from an unknown creature. So all we really have here, unfortunately, is the eyewitness reports and the police follow-ups to those.
Right. Now, one of the things that is described with the Lizard Man is that it has red eyes. That's one of the more common descriptions, right?
Right, yep.
Now, John Keel, among others, had always pointed out that red-eyed monsters tend to seem to have more paranormal properties. Do you think this could be something that is not what it seems, that might have some paranormal explanation behind it?
Well, I mean, I suppose you can't discount anything given the strange qualities of the case, but, none of the witnesses ever reported seeing any kind of out of the ordinary supernatural type behaviors for the creature. In other words, there was no shimmering. It didn't disappear. It didn't just suddenly appear. It appeared in all respects to be some kind of a biological creature of some sort, albeit, a strange one. So I didn't find a lot of a direct connection in the eyewitness descriptions to, supernatural or paranormal or however you want to term it. But there's a lot of theories when you start talking about lizard men or reptilian humanoids. There's a lot of theories that come into play related to this whole concept of a reptilian race that may live in caverns under the earth. They're ancient and they've lived there all along, or they're from other planets and things like that. So I kind of include, what people generally think about reptilian humanoids, but in my particular investigation, I didn't find anything that would lead me to believe this was anything other than some sort of a either an animal or a person in a suit or anything else like that would be extraterrestrial or paranormal.
The swamp itself, Skateboard Swamp, is it? Have there been any reports of other paranormal type phenomena there, or any other creatures or anything like that?
And I looked into that, and I found a few scant ghost stories that were associated with the area. There was a particular story that I thought was rather fascinating, and of course include that in the book. That there was a woman who had been murdered by an axe long ago down in that area, and it's kind of gruesome, but they mounted the axe on her gravestone. There was an old iron axe, big old heavy thing, and tales started emerging regarding that axe, that it would spin, at night, or on Halloween it would rise up and levitate above the grave and things like that. And the axe actually ended up being stolen several times, and Sheriff Truesdale ended up tracking it down. And so I thought that was kind of a cool. It was very, very urban legend-esque. I mean, so much more urban legend with something like that. But it was, at least an interesting sideline to the whole Skateboard Swamp story. Outside of that, I mean, there was some older newspaper reports from the 1800s talking about a creature called the Bishopville Giant, something that had walked through that area. But in this case, it literally walked through the streets one day and then disappeared into a well in a neighboring township. So, some really strange stuff.
Yeah, that was a fascinating story, actually. What was I just going to ask you about? So, if you had a bet on it, would you think this is a lizard man, or do you think this is a version of a Bigfoot-like creature? Well,
I don't want to put a lot of money riding on this, but if I had to, I'd probably go. I kind of like the Bigfoot theory personally. I mean, there's some other good theories, but it just simply because it's harder to explain for me personally a lizard man. I mean, the biological concept of anything that is either a hybrid between reptilian and human, or any such thing like that, or an extinct dinosaur that has evolved into a more anthropomorphic humanoid form, is a stretch for me. But I guess, for whatever reason, I've researched a lot of Bigfoot, and I think it's certainly I believe Bigfoot is a possibility. I think there's something there, and perhaps this was a Bigfoot, and the locals just called it the Lizard Man. Whereas, near Fouke, Arkansas, they call the thing the Fouke Monster. And people ask me, do you think it's a Sasquatch? Well, yeah. I mean, it's a 7-foot-tall, hairy, man-like ape, as people described. So even though they call it the Fouke Monster, or in East Texas, they call it the Caddo Critter. Just like that, if people called it the Lizard Man, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's something completely far-fetched. It could be it could be a creature like that, but it could be a Bigfoot. So again, I think all that just sort of comes back to the point that I think most of those witnesses did see something strange and something undocumented, whether it was a Bigfoot or a Lizard Man. Bottom line is they saw some strange stuff that you just can't explain.
And what do you see a lot of connections between Boggy Creek and this?
Well, just yeah, I do. Just in the way it unfolded, you got your small town. On the edge of the small town is a swampy area, and then sightings of this made the newspapers and became a media sensation, and then some of the old timers or locals in the area said, "Hey, wait, there was other sightings before this. This thing has been around," and then the story carried on, and there was, tracks found. There was three-toed tracks found, and et cetera, et cetera. So, with the exception of the movie The Legend of Boggy Creek being made about the monster and making him much more famous, other than that, these cases are so similar in the way they evolved, and I think that's why it was fascinating for me. And because I like those kind of tales. It's southern. It's small town meets monster. It's swampy. It's a creature with a cool name, and it's ultimately spooky. I mean, I think I'm, like I said, I'm a fan of horror movies. I'm intrigued by cryptozoology and just the mystery behind these creatures. So I do like the fact that it's a scary story. It's spooky. People were down there and saw something they can't explain, and it was quite shocking, I'm sure, for these witnesses.
And why do you think people are so fascinated by monster stories?
Well, I think in some ways, I mean, it's the same as people love a good ghost tale. They love a horror movie. They love the thought that there's something out there that can get us. It's a thrill. We're flirting with the unknown, with the mystery, and people need to have some mystery in their life. I mean, and I mean that's why, I am successful at writing these books. That's why your radio show is successful and you have listeners, because I think people love these subjects and want to we want to sort them out, but we also love the chase, the trying to pursue these mysteries. And it gives us something outside of our mundane life, of driving to work in the traffic and coming home and, in a routine. This sort of gives us something that is outside the norm, something unexplained.
And there were some legends in this area, too, about lizard men back from, like, native tribes and stuff, weren't there?
Yeah, that's one thing that I thought was really kind of spooky, because in all these cases I try to look back as far as I can to establish that there were previous sightings, and the Native American tribes, which lived there 500 years prior to the lizard man sightings, actually had some tales or legends or whatever you want to call it about a race of reptilian humanoid creatures they called something that translated to sharp tails. And these creatures were said to have kind of reptilian skin, and they had these sort of short, hard tails. In fact, they had to dig a hole in order to sit down. But they lived on fish, and they said once the fish source had been depleted, they never saw these men again. But just the fact that the Native Americans reported any kind of reptilian or scaly humanoid living there 500 years earlier that's just crazy. I mean, because the witnesses who reported seeing the lizard man, or who coined that name in 1988, I can guarantee you they had no knowledge of that. That's something you got to really dig in a library to find. And so that's either highly coincidental or foreshadowing of what may exist down there in Skateboard Swamp.
Well, the book is fantastic. I highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in this type of stuff. There's a lot more in the book than what we've talked about. You really get into detail on some of the sightings and some of the media coverage, as well as exploring some other cryptozoology, like similar lizard man tales around the world or around the U.S. And the book is available where?
It's available, signed copies from my website, and also on Amazon, barnesandnoble.com. The best way to really find the links to the books would be to visit my website, which is Lyle Blackburn, Lyle Blackburn.com. And you can start there, and I'll give you links to the book in whatever flavor you may desire.
And what do you think you're going to be looking into next? Any idea?
Well, I think I'm going to do something that's a little more comprehensive on the next go-round, whereas the first two books concentrated, on a specific case. I think I'm going to do something more along the lines of probably a Bigfoot book that would cover more of a wider range of states. Because I have been doing a lot of research in other states and things, so I think I'm going to open it up and do something more comprehensive on the next one.
Your band Ghoultown still on hold?
Yeah, pretty much. I'm just with the TV shows and the writing books, and it's been so successful that there's just not enough hours in the day, so the band is still sort of been floating in limbo.
But is it something you think you might get back to someday, or not sure?
I don't know. All the band members, most of the other band members are in other bands, and those bands are quite busy. So it's always been a balance between what we can do. We don't even all live in the same city, so we've tried to do some shows, but I think our lives have become busier, and it's harder to do. And I find myself, successful writing books, and I really like doing it and not being on the road. So. I really don't know what's going to happen with the band. Though, the band's still popular. I've still got a lot of people coming around and new people discovering it. So I think it's still getting exposure for our music that is still fresh to new people.
And until the Boggy Creek book, I hadn't actually heard of Ghoultown either. And now I've picked up your stuff and really enjoy it. So.
Right, there you go. And that's been kind of the funny thing, like the ironic thing about it is, through my success on this end, it's exposed the band to a lot of people that wouldn't normally have come across it, who end up liking the band. So it's, that's good. And I think in everything I do, it just sort of promotes the works that I have done previous.
All right. And what any speaking events or anything else coming up? You mentioned the TV shows.
Yeah. Let's see. In March, I'll be doing the Weird Tex Fest in Glen Rose, Texas. I think that's March the 22nd. And then I'm going to be in Ohio at the Ohio Bigfoot Conference on April the 26th. That's going to be a great one with a lot of big names in the Bigfoot world. So I'm looking forward to that. But people can see my my appearances on my website. So definitely go there and even sign up on my newsletter, and then I can hit you up because I'll be in Buffalo later in August at another event. And
right.
So I'm quite frequently in surprising places around the country.
All right. Well, I thank you for talking to us tonight, and we're going to close off with something from Ghoultown. Off of Life After Sundown, we were looking at Drink with the Living Dead.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, and hopefully we'll be talking to you again soon. Maybe we can do something in August around that Buffalo date.
Yeah, sounds good. That'd be great.
All right, here's Ghoultown, Drink with the Living Dead. Last Exit for the Lost is up next. You're on WVBR FM. Ithaca.